Thank y'all for having me.
Hi, I'm Krista, and like she said, I was actually born in LA, but in the Valley, and I was raised in Lafayette, Louisiana. So on the outside, I'm Filipino, and on the inside, I'm Cajun French. So I call myself the Cajun Asian. So both sides of my family, very family-oriented. We love good food, music, and dancing. We love each other's company and games. When I got involved in the pro-life movement, it was around 2015. I started working for this organization, Louisiana Right to Life. A lot of you are from the Right to Life League here in California. Well, when I started working there and doing youth programs, kind of similar to Vox Vitae actually, which many of you probably know about, I worked with a lot of people who told me a lot of stories. And I'm here to tell you one more story. And maybe you've heard it before, and I apologize if it's old for you, but it is a story of a woman who came to this country with a hope for a better life, with a hope of a better future for herself, for her family, for her children. And she was a huge sacrifice for her family to send her over here. She was the firstborn in her family. And when she got here, she got a job, she got a boyfriend, she got pregnant, and her boyfriend wanted her to have an abortion. Now, this is a lot of people's stories. So this is what's special about this one, is that even though her boyfriend threatened to break up with her, and even when her parents threatened to disown her for not having an abortion, she still chose life. And that woman was my mother. Oh. And that baby was me. Yeah, so praise God that my mom chose life for me. And I got to have a beautiful life. Although I did suffer quite a bit, I did not grow up knowing my biological father. That's, of course, its own wound, and probably my core wound, or my signature theme in life, is that feeling of being an orphan. Later in life, I did get to meet him. I was 22, actually 10 years ago, around the time of my college graduation. He came back around. We started meeting up. I started talking to him about my story of origin, because I had only really known my mom's side of the story. And perhaps not so prudently, we were having breakfast at IHOP, so over some pancakes. I just very boldly asked, "Are you glad that my mom didn't have an abortion?" What a question to ask at IHOP, right? And so he began to tell me, he began to cry, which, why would I bring that conversation there? I don't know. He began to cry, and he told me, men hurt too. Men hurt too. And he said that he had an abortion with a woman after my mom. Oh. And so virtually the same exact circumstance. Immigrants from the Philippines, unmarried, in their 20s, and she had an abortion. And my first instinct when my father told me that, because I worked at Louisiana Right to Life, and I knew of things like Rachel's Vineyard and all these Grief to Grace, those kinds of retreats, that was the first response that I had to him. Because I've met many people who told me about their abortions, and all I wanted to do was give him resources. And so I did that. That IHOP was in Vegas. I was flying back home because he was here and I'm still in Louisiana. So I was flying back home to Louisiana. Sitting on the airplane in this middle seat, it was dawning on me that that sibling was my sibling, even if only a half sibling. And I began to weep, really ugly cry, and we were taking off, and so I knew it looked like I just had flight anxiety. I felt like someone was about to ask me, "Have you never flown before?" Because I was just weeping that. Luckily, the person who picked me up was my co-director at Louisiana Right to Life, who knew my story, and not just knew my story, but had walked with me over the course of a couple of years as my own story unfolded to me through the time that I was giving youth education presentations. And so different parts of my story would come up, and this was just another part of it for me. And after finding out about my sibling who died by abortion, I was in the worst, lowest point of my life. And I had many sorrows, as I said. Growing up not knowing a biological father is a great deep sorrow. My parents divorced when I was in college, that was a great deep sorrow. Relationships end, those are great deep sorrows. But this was the first time that I really asked God, "Can you deliver me from this? Can you help me here? Are you going to be here for me at this time?" And it was this great sorrow. University, as I sat with that for years. My capstone project, as was mentioned, was researching just this: the effect of abortion on people who are what I call sibling survivors. The way you see it in an obituary, so-and-so is survived by their wife, their kids, their grandkids. So sibling survivors, like me, experience something that Dr. Philip Ney from UBC in Canada called PASS, Post-Abortion Survivor Syndrome, PASS. So I got the kind of academic knowledge or academic language for what I was experiencing at the time that I learned about my sibling. It didn't help, by the way, that when I was giving these educational presentations, I was talking about abortion in detail, the medical diagrams, and I never really like to show images because of my sibling, but I showed medical diagrams and described the methods of abortion about 70 times a year to thousands of young students. And so after 3.5 years of that, it was taking a toll truly on my heart, and that's why I actually stepped out of that for a while. But what I found through my research at Life-Affirming University is that sibling survivors experience something like PTSD, which most people know what that is, post-traumatic stress disorder, right? But PTSD, unlike PASS, points to a specific moment, right? So people who have PTSD might have dreams that point back to that moment, or memories that flash back to a specific moment. PASS is more like a lifelong spectrum of an experience. And so it could include kind of metaphoric dreams, but you don't really understand what it means. For instance, I knew of a sibling who one day was having a dream about being in the sandbox as a kid, and she looked over and there were like 3 other kids who she knew were her siblings, and she told her mom about this dream because the siblings got sucked into it like quicksand, and she was like, "Oh, what a weird dream! I had this dream that 3 siblings in the sandbox were taken by the sandbox." Come to find out that mom had 3 abortions. And so there's this kind of intuitive knowledge that siblings experience. And not just that, but whenever there's shame around the family, even if the sibling doesn't know exactly what the shame is from, they can sense the way that parents talk about things, or they have this sense of doom in their household. And I think this is especially so for people who share a room with their sibling, which I didn't happen to do that, but from what I see, people who share a room with their sibling do have a sort of grief and a sort of sadness that has to do with their relationship with their parents and maybe a lack of trust. Dr. Philip Ney, who I mentioned earlier, speaks about this through a little anecdote. And his study was on, does pregnancy loss affect the children, not just the mom? Does it affect the mom's children? And he found there was a significant difference for people whose siblings died by abortion than by miscarriage. The way he illustrates that is, in the case of miscarriage, which of course is sorrowful and it's very sad, and for anyone who's experienced that, one of my best friends just had 3 miscarriages in the last year, I understand that super, super deep sorrow. In the case of miscarriage, a sibling survivor are more likely to be able to move on because it's kind of like an accident happen. So it's like if a family's on a beach trip and they're walking on a cliff, it's more like a sibling fell off the cliff on accident. And yes, of course, it's a great tragedy, but they're ultimately, sibling survivors can move on from life after a miscarriage because it just kind of happens, and it was an accident. Dr. Philip Ney would say that sibling survivors of abortion, it's more like that cliffside. You're walking on the cliff and a parent push off one of the children. And we can't really afford both of them either. That sorrow isn't just from the death of the child, but also in the aftermath of the family, how the family continues to operate on that. This is my story. It's still unfolding, working with other sibling survivors. What I really am trying to say is that abortion, as my dad was telling me that day at IHOP, hurts men. What I'm here to say is it hurts siblings. It's a very complex grief. There's a lot to it. I try to be very patient and gentle because my ministry isn't really a pro-life ministry. I'm not trying to convince anybody of anything. I'm just trying to help people heal after their sadness and their grief. And it's complicated and it's layered. There's many other layers for most of these people. But what we're here for today is for the Pregnancy Center. When I first started giving this talk, I always used to focus on the fact that my mom chose life for me. Everything I do for my mom who chose life for me and for my sibling who wasn't as fortunate. And when I think about being here, especially in LA, where I was born, and and sharing this story. I think there's a special part in my heart that I'm excited to share that with you, because I always gave that talk in Louisiana. But my mom chose life here, where there were limited resources, where she had no family, she was an immigrant. My bio dad turned his back on her, but she chose life for me here in LA. And I always think, and someone was talking about this at my table, she said Padre Pio talked about how prayer is timeless, that prayer is outside of time, because God's outside of time. And I've always felt that the people that I asked to pray for, people in pregnancy situations like my mom, for them to choose life. When you pray for pregnant women to choose life, I feel like you saved my life then, because prayer is outside of time. And so I've always have felt that the people that I serve, the people that I share this story with, who do, as a result, maybe pray for life, pray for women to choose life, or families to choose life, or who do things to help legislative change, to be more life supporting. I really feel that that is what saved my life when my mom had no one. I was doing some research, because I usually only know Louisiana statistics, but in 1992, the year I was born, there were 1.5 million abortions. 1.5 million abortions. So I was one of the few who was born because my mom chose life. I was trying to find LA specific details, but I could only find that about 304,000 of those abortions were here in California. Just as a comparison, I know Louisiana is a much smaller state, but it's usually about 10,000 in Louisiana. So from 10,000 to 304,000 abortions per year. That's a huge, huge chunk of abortions of the national statistics. The work of the Pregnancy Center is so much more vital here, so much more needed. We need to provide life-affirming options for women, for young women and young mothers here in California. Because if it's the case that a woman feels like she has to have an abortion, that's not a choice. That's not pro-choice. If she feels cornered into the decision, like my mom was, that ultimatums were given to her, not support. Get an abortion or I'll break up with you. Get an abortion or we'll disown you, which my grandparents did. But when I was 2 years old, she brought me to the Philippines, and I was a cute little pigtail girly, straight across bangs that were crooked because I cooked myself. My grandparents loved me, and I never knew that. Never knew that. Until way later in life. That when my mom was pregnant, they wrote her letters. She sent pictures of herself pregnant to them. They mailed it back with X's on her stomach. You know, but I didn't know that. Because I had a beautiful life. My Lola loved me. I was her favorite. But I didn't know that. But the fact that my mom experienced that kind of pressure, which, even though that was the 90s, and the pressure to abort was probably pretty high because unwed pregnancy was maybe a little more uncommon, and people talk behind her back and everything like that. I think there's still a stigma with being a young mother. There's still a stigma with being a young mother. And so that's why women feel forced into abortion. In the pregnancy centers and what they provide, the services they provide, especially medical ones, medical services like ultrasounds. When I worked in pregnancy centers, I've seen that they usually say that whenever a woman can hear the heartbeat, that can be pretty life-changing. So in Louisiana, they have a heartbeat bill. When they hear that heartbeat, it's life-changing because, oh wow, now it's not a clump of cells. They have a heartbeat. And I just heard, I've never heard of this before, the pregnancy centers have a portable ultrasound machine that they can take to them, which I think is phenomenal. It's so hard to get around LA, but that's something that I learned moving here. I never had anxiety on the freeway until I lived here. So that was new for me. But getting around in public transportation, those are huge barriers for people. And you know, they said that there's a bus stop right in front of the Planned Parenthood. So they make it easier to get to that Planned Parenthood, than the pregnancy center. But if they have these opportunities to go to women where they are so that they can hear that baby's heartbeats, they're more likely to choose life. I mean, that's phenomenal. I've not heard of that. That's amazing. Technology is great. This is a great use of technology. So when you support a pregnancy center and you support women and you help them make life-affirming choices, I've heard there's even maternity homes here, which is more rare in other parts. Like in Louisiana, super rare to have a maternity center. The time that I was working at Louisiana, it's like there's only one maternity center. But I think there's like at least 65 in Southern California pregnancy centers and maternity homes. I think 65 for SoCal, 150 pregnancy centers in California. And people need to know about these services so that the first thing on their mind isn't checking that box going to the Planned Parenthood and getting an abortion. Because they're not offering life-affirming choices at Planned Parenthoods. They're not. Why would they? They get their money from abortion. They get their money from abortion. And so pregnancy centers who are closing is because we're not profiting off of things that Planned Parenthood is profiting off of. You know, a couple years ago they had Live Action was talking about they were selling baby body parts, right? Do you remember that campaign a few years ago? That's why they have so much money. That's why their marketing is so good. That's why their websites are good. But the pregnancy centers are here to help, and they're not profiting off of women. Everything that you give, the ways that you support, is helping women choose life. So it's very important to support our pregnancy centers, especially locally. Especially locally. I think that's going to be huge. It's going to be huge for like what it does to your heart when you start getting involved, when you start learning these people's stories. It's cause for conversion in your own heart. So I encourage you to give in the way that you can give. Mother Teresa has this beautiful quote. She said, "Some give by going." And what I think she means by that in this circumstance, priority, is that some people run pregnancy centers. Some people run events like this. Some people donate their food from their restaurant. Some people do legislative work. Some give by going and doing, but others go by giving. And then another quote verse, together we can do great things, no? So maybe some of you don't like public speaking. Most people don't. This is what I love. I love public speaking. I love having a microphone in my hand. Most people would rather not do that. That's okay. This is the way that I give. This is the way that I go. But what's the way that you can give? What's the way that you can go? What's something that you can do to support young women and young families, especially here in Los Angeles? I hope God blesses you. I thank you for being here. I thank you for giving generously to the Pregnancy Center. And thank you for building a culture of life and civilization of love.